Okay, so this is the second video in the Bringing It All Together series for the poetry essay, in which I'm actually going to model this process a bit for you. Now remember, you'll be doing this with a poem of your own selection from the textbook. It must come from the textbook. It cannot be a poem that has been already analyzed by me in lecture or discussed by me in lecture. It needs to be a poem in the textbook that I have not discussed. Now, there's over 500 poems in the book, so this should be pretty easy to do. At least I think there's 500. I haven't counted each one, but there's quite a lot. A few recommendations I'm going to make before you select is one, that you select a poem that has examples of all the elements I discussed in the previous lecture and the previous lectures as a whole. This will give you more to talk about, more to write about. It's always good to have too much to write about and then to practice narrowing it down rather than picking a poem like Carnation Milk, which, although is really funny and a lot of fun, really doesn't have a lot to talk about. The other suggestion, though, is that you pick a poem that clearly has not just all these elements, but clearly has a structure that's tied to its meaning. Remember Creeley's quote about form being an extension of content. In fact, let me add that to the notes here. Form is never more than an extension of content. And that's sort of a paraphrase of Robert Creeley, who's a great poet. And then you also have Marvin Bell's poetry uses words to get beyond words. All good concepts to keep in your mind as you are selecting a poem and beginning this very very intense process. This is a very intense process. So the first step for you is to select a poem that moves you in some way when you read it the first time. This poem by Rutke does not appear in the textbook, In a Dark Time, but it's one of my favorites, so that's why I selected it. So select a poem that you enjoy. That's step one. Step two is to experience the poem in a variety of ways. Read it out loud. Find a, let's see if I can type, find a recording of it and listen. Record yourself reading it and listen. Have someone else read it and talk with him or her. Have them, him or her, read it out loud back to you. Try to experience it in as many different ways as you can. Now you have 14 days to experience it, and this experience can continue happening even after you've started the other processes. So, you know, for example, this poem, In a Dark Time by Theodore Rutke, I've read this so many times, and I've gotten so many experiences out of it. You know, you can listen to me read it. In a Dark Time by Theodore Rutke. In a dark time the eye begins to see. I meet my shadow in the deepening shade. I hear my echo in the echoing wood, a lord of nature weeping to a tree. I live between the heron and the wren, beasts of the hill and serpents of the den. What's madness but nobility of soul, at odds with circumstance? The day's on fire. I know the purity of pure despair. My shadow pinned against the sweating wall. That place among the rocks, is it a cave or a winding path? the edge is what I have. A steady stream of correspondences, a night flowing with birds, a ragged moon, and in broad day the midnight come again. A man goes far to find out what he is. Death of the self in a long tearless night, all natural shapes blazing unnatural light. Dark, dark my light, and darker my desire. My soul, like some heat-maddened summer fly, keeps buzzing at the sill. Which eye is I? A fallen man, I climb out of my fear. The mind enters itself, and God the mind, and one is one, free in the tearing wind. You can listen to me read it. You can read it yourself out loud. You can also go to YouTube, as I have done in the past with you all, and you can find a video recording of where you actually have the audio of Rutke reading it. Let me see if I can find the one that I want. People make movies with this stuff all the time. Maybe this is the one. Maybe this will work.
In a dark time, the eye begins to see. I meet my shadow in the deepening shade. I hear my echo in the echoing wood. A lord of nature, weeping to a tree. I live between the heron and the red. Beasts of the hill and servants of the dead.
That's somebody else reading it, and they're not really reading it very well. But you can also look up documentaries. There's a documentary that was done here a long time ago about Theodore Rutke, and that gives you some background about it, and you hear him reading at the opening of it.
In a dark time, the eye begins to see. I meet my shadow in the deepening shade. I hear my echo in the echoing wood.
So there's lots of resources out there, lots of different recordings of him reading the poem. And the same thing would be true of whichever poem you find here. You might not find a video or recording of it. You might actually find a documentary where the poet, or an interview where the poet actually talks about the poem. The more contemporary the poem is, the more difficult it might be to find something useful in that sense. But I do want and insist upon this experiential aspect of understanding the poem. Very, very important to having a feel for how to interpret the poem. But once you have done that, then it is time to go and start applying. Begin analyzing the poem using each lens. So the first lens we're going to use actually is we're going to use the oral language lens because it's the one that takes the most time with most poems. I can tell by listening to this poem and experiencing this poem that that's going to be the most important aspect of this poem. So the first thing I am going to do is I'm actually going to scan it. Scan the poem for stresses and slacks, and I'm going to answer some questions. What is the poem's dominant metrical foot? Why is the poem, why does its metrical feet why, actually here's a better version of that question. Why change the meter when Rutke does? How does the meter connect with content? Now, The answers to these questions will be my explanations and topic sentences in my essay for this section that deals with oral language. If I have a section dedicated just to rhythm, this would actually help me do that. I would also actually do a section with rhyme, review the poem's internal and external rhyme structures. I need to answer the question, what is the poem's rhyme scheme? What types of rhyme are employed? And then I would also analyze its overall sound. What review uses of sound structures? What types of sound patterns are used? Why use those patterns? Now, some poems are going to really just focus on this element. That's it. That's all that we'll really focus on. And this will become the bulk of your paper. Other poems, this will be a much smaller section of your paper, and the only way to determine how much of your paper will deal with these issues is to analyze the poem. So let's start analyzing this poem. So how do you show the meter of a poem in Microsoft Office? Now, there are a bunch of different ways of doing this. I'm going to show you a way that I want you to do it for my class. This isn't necessarily the correct way, but I find this is the easiest way to do it, particularly for people who are submitting papers online, because it's pretty difficult to put those symbols above each metrical foot. So I just use the highlighting option. So I go in A, and in this instance, I am going to stress N, because to me that's much stronger than A. Dark time, and I'm going to stress both of these. So notice how I've highlighted that. And what I've created here, I can use this little mark to show the metrical feet. 2 syllables. I've created a trochee and a spondee. And then I have a caesura here. I have a pause with that comma. And then I get this, which every 2 syllables, right? The I is stronger than the, begins. In this case, I would actually stress B. Some of my students in my face-to-face classes stress gens to C. And so I actually, in this first line, I have a trochee, a spondee, an iamb, a trochee, and a iamb. And that means I don't know what the dominant foot is yet. But if I look at the next line, I meet my shad O in the deep ending shade. Here I actually have a iamb, an iamb, an iamb, an iamb, and an anapest. So it's safe to assume that the dominant foot of this poem would be iamb. So if I were to answer this question, I would say iamb. And then I could talk about the metrical, the stress pattern here. And if I look, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. But in this one, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Just to be certain, I'm going to scan this line. highlighter's not working with me too well. I hear my echo in the echoing wood. Notice how that line is almost exactly metrically the same as the previous line. And if you watch that documentary about Rutke that I showed you briefly on YouTube, he talks about the importance of sound and rhythm to poetry. So here I have 5 stresses again, so I know I'm dealing primarily with pentameter. Because remember, we name the lines by their stresses. And then I would have to go in and actually analyze. Now that I see that there's a pattern here, a very distinct pattern, I would need to go in and analyze where the changes are. Obviously, the changes are in the first line, but there's a few other changes we can find as we go. And we'd have to ask ourselves why those changes, why they're, what is Rutke trying to do to connect the rhythm to the content. So that's how you do all of this. And remember, this question is really the question that starts this section of the paper. So when you go to write the paper, the answer to that question would be the topic sentence for a section on rhythm. Now, what you might discover, some of you, when you select your poem, is that there is no meter in the poem, in which case you would simply show that you have scanned the poem, and you would talk about the fact that meter doesn't really play a major role in its composition, and really ask why that is. So if I were to be quoting this and showing this in my paper, I would say something along the lines of Rutke's poem is organized metrically. For example, and then I would do a block quote format. I would go in and I would copy and paste from my notes. And notice I would create these notes. I'd copy and paste from my notes some of the lines I've scanned. I would paste them into the paper. And then I would put something along the lines of this for the line numbers. Now, why would I put the line numbers there instead of the page number of the poem? Well, because this poem appears in multiple texts. I know it appears in a collection by Theodore Rutke. I actually copy and pasted the poem this time from a website. I know it appears in a number of textbooks, even though it doesn't appear in ours. So with poetry, we always cite the line number in our in-text citation. I wouldn't need to use a last name there because this is the only poem I'm analyzing. In fact, for this essay, you really shouldn't be using any other source except for the poem. So when you do your works cited, you would do something along the lines of this. Let's pretend that this poem appears in our textbook. I'm fairly certain it doesn't, but I will look to be certain, because they change what poems appear in the textbook every edition, every few editions. So let's see here. Nope, it's not in there. We have My Papa's Waltz and Root Cellar, but let's pretend it does. You would put the title of you'd put the author, just like a short story entry in your works cited. You would put the title of the poem, whatever that might be. You would put the title of the textbook, as you have done before, Literature, An Introduction to Fiction, Poetry, Drama, and Writing, You would have to put the addition in the editors. And then you would put the publication information, Boston, Pearson. Then you would put the copyright date, format, and whatever the page numbers are. And that would be it. And you'd have to do a hanging indent. So it's exactly the same citation you did or you've been doing for the short stories, but instead you would put the poem author, last name, and the page number, and then this is the line numbers. So if you wanted to show just lines, you would say just at one line or two lines, Rothke's poem is organized metrically, for example. And then you would just pick two of the lines and you would have to use this sign here that we use to show the line breaks. We'd have to take out all of these hash marks and just have one to show the line break. And this is true for any poem that's organized into lines. So this would be 1 through, or 2 through 3 with a period. And notice I kept, in this instance, I kept the highlighting to show the meter. I would take that out if I was just talking about something else. And of course, this would be double-spaced like all MLA citation is. It would always be double-spaced. So that's how you illustrate that in your paper with the lines. Okay, so now the next thing I would do is I would look at the rhyme scheme of the poem. And this poem's tricky because actually what we're dealing with in this poem is a lot of slant rhymes like shade and wood. Remember, the definition of a slant rhyme is that the final consonant sound is the same even if the verb sound is different. So I can actually go in and insert a text box here, and I can do the rhyme scheme of this. Let's do this. Sorry. This stanza. And it's actually A, B, B, C, or sorry, A, D, D. And then, remember, with a poem, we don't necessarily go back. We don't necessarily restart. We actually keep going with the letters. We would use capital letters if a word repeated, but since no words repeat, we just keep going with the letters. So this is a new sound, soul, and we know, remember, it has to be lowercase because it's not a refrain. Fire and despair are a slant rhyme, so we give those F, F, G, or sorry, E, and G, and G. And I'd go through and do this for each one. Now, one of the things you start to ask yourself when you look at these rhymes, particularly the end rhymes, is why? What possible purpose could there be for so many slants? And if you look at the content of the poem, this poem in particular, it really actually works a lot for slants, because what you have is a person who's turning inward to himself in order to achieve some sort of enlightenment. And through that enlightenment, he's going through this, what St. John of the Cross would have called the long dark night of the soul, or the great cloud of unknowing, where he finds himself unified with knowledge at the end of the poem. When we get to the end of the poem, we have this idea of the mind enters itself, and God, the mind, which the word that's missing here is enters, and one is one, and look at the capitalization of one there, which gets to the typography, free and the tearing wind. So despite there being this chaos and this insanity of this tearing wind, there's a unity that's come about here for the poem. There's a unity for him, his self, his identity from the poem. So that element is really showing in these rhymes, because you see here we have these whole rhymes, the rin and din, these close rhymes, sea and tree, but then we have these slants where as his sanity starts to break down, and we have these I rhymes, cave and have. They don't really visually rhyme or sonically rhyme. I guess you could say they're sort of slant, but they do visually rhyme. And that repeats across each stanza. Mind and wind do not rhyme really except for as slants, but they visually rhyme. But night and light both rhyme sonically and visually. And so this pattern repeats throughout the poem. And another question to ask yourself, because the pattern in the rhyme reveals something very specific about the poem in this instance, is why in a poem where somebody is having basically a psychological meltdown, uh, is it so controlled? Why create something with such control as this? What possible purpose could there be for that choice as well? And so you see these questions sometimes overlap and start to lead and filter into each other. You can also look at the sounds of this piece, like the echo and echoing, how that mimics the echo and the shadow. And then we have the weeping, deepening, echoing, these sounds repeating, heron and rin, the R's and the E's, which show the chaos, the assonance and alliteration in there. There's lots and lots of sonic elements. Okay, so that will probably take you at least an hour or two of analysis. So once you've done that, you can start then looking at the organization, typographical organization. Yeah, it sounds like, whoa, man, that's a lot, right? But if you think about it, there's lots of time to do this paper if you are using your time wisely. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the visual language of the poem, the stuff that comes across when we're reading silently. So are there font changes? And we know there is one. Are there non-grammatical capitalizations? And we know there is one. What is the stanzaic structure of the poem? So how is it organized? You know, we can go on and on with these questions. The truth is, a lot of the questions that you ask will be tied to your experience of the poem. So when we look at this poem, we know every stanza in this Rutke poem is 6 lines. We know that the lines are very tightly connected. Each stanza, they're not much longer or shorter than each other. And we do have these two instances of non-grammatical choices of typography that really jump out. Some poems have more, some poems have less. If you're dealing with an E. E. Cummings poem, this section is going to be much larger than this section. So again, it depends on the poem. And then you have to ask yourself, yet again, why? Be 4 years old again and asking the question, why is the poet doing this? Why is the poet doing this? Why could they possibly be doing this? And again, we have a poem that's dealing with this moment of depression, of darkness, and how that finally comes about to a certain enlightenment or realization. So why make it so visually controlled and structured? This is what we'd call a nonce form. As far as I know, there's not a form that's 4 stanzas, 6 lines in each stanza that has this sort of rhyme scheme. It looks like something Rutke might have invented. But it is interesting that he chose that structure considering the content that's there. And then you would go on and you would talk about the ideational language section and ask yourself many of these same questions. What figures of speech are present? What clearly understood symbolic language is used? You know, what allusions are in the poem? And then, of course, why? Now remember, again, each of these whys is basically a topic sentence for the essay. So if you look at the structure, you already have built in here, you already have built in your topic sentences. And then all the analysis you did would be the examples to support it. So when you come up with an answer for why, this would be your support it. Now, the last little bit to talk about here then is probably the one that you're scratching your head the most on at this point. And that is the thesis, because you know that the way I've taught it, a thesis needs to be an argument. So how can you argue something if meaning doesn't matter? And some of you have asked that question in your discussion boards. Well, here's the gag. Meaning matters now. Because you have analyzed the poem using an understanding of the elements of poetry. So here's the thing, is you can't really discuss the meaning of something if you don't know how it's put together. I can't tell you what a Camaro means because I have no idea what makes a Camaro, nor can I really tell you about a sunset because I don't really understand what makes a sunset. I'm not a scientist, so I wouldn't even endeavor to discuss those things. However, I study poetry. That's what I do for a living, partially, and I do love it as an art form, and I've read a lot of it, and I've thought about it, so now I have the terminology. I understand the terminology and the structure and the process for telling you what a poem means. Prior to this, you didn't have that really. You may have had inklings of it, but you didn't really have that. So any meaning you had come up with for a poem would have been sort of a knee-jerk reaction. It may have been correct, but it wouldn't have been grounded in fact. You wouldn't have been able to explain where the meaning came from. So now you develop your thesis based on your interpretation of the poem using these steps of explication analysis. So now your understanding of the poem would be this. So when you answer the question, what does the poem mean? Or answer the question, what is the poem's central concerns? Because you might still not be sure what the poem means, but you might be able to pick up on what its central concerns are. Now when you go to answer that question, you have all of these notes that you've taken and used to come to that conclusion. Your conclusion is not based on your gut, it's based on actual research and close reading. This, my friends, is what we call a structuralist or a new critical approach to analyzing the poem, and it's something that is a bit of a lost art in our culture, particularly for young people. They no longer read things this way. And this is why I'm teaching it to you, because I believe there's a certain level of appreciating the poem that is lost in not reading the poem as an artifact, as a piece of art that has its own distinct concerns and own distinct ways of constructing it. So its meaning should be derived from that sort of understanding. And I truly believe that in a way. It's not that you can belittle the cultural context, it's just the cultural context isn't necessarily as meaningful as this. And it's the reason. This is the reason poems that are 200, 300, 400 years old still move us, even though our culture is entirely different than that of the authors. Because there's something in language that totally transcends time, and when you emphasize the language over the fact that it's a male writer or a female writer, or they're talking about a love story, or any of these cultural concerns that cultural critics use, when you emphasize the language over that, it makes the poem more powerful in a sense. And that's not to say that you should never read a poem culturally. I think that's important as well too. But I think you should be able to do this before you do that. It's sort of like crawling before you walk and walking before you run. If you just go straight to running, you're going to be confused. So, process. Type the poem in a Word document, print it out, chop it up, write it up, analyze it, scan it, take pictures of your work, insert those pictures in your paper following the actual paper itself. So let me talk about my expectations of the submission of this paper for a minute so that I'm very, very clear with you. So this is all the process for developing the paper, how to cite it, how to understand it, how to pull all these concepts together with a model using a poem. Now, what I want to see in this poem beyond the basic MLA, beyond not using second person, all that nitpicky stuff we talk about in 1301, is I also want to see this, the structure of the poem. I want the turn in the poem, or the explication. How to turn in the explication. I want you to have first your paper. In MLA format, following all the guidelines. And here's where things are going to change, though. Before the works cited page, insert in pages showing your analysis process of the poem using these 3 lenses. Now, in order to do that, there's 2 things you can do. You can either retype the poem as I did here and do everything in Microsoft Office, right? And then just put this as the last couple pages of your essay before you're works cited. Or you can print this out, do all this by hand, and take pictures and insert the picture. So if you want to insert a picture in Microsoft Office, it's pretty easy, especially with the newer version that you get for free through our college. You simply go in and you go to Insert, you find your pictures. Let's look what we have here. No pictures in there. Sample pictures. We'll just use a sample picture to show you. And you select the picture and you hit insert and there's the picture. It's that simple, and you can resize it this way, what have you. It's not that hard to do. So you can take a picture, you can send that picture to yourself via email as an attachment, you can download it to your desktop and then insert it by going insert pictures. If you want to do it the old-fashioned way by hand, taking notes by hand. Now, some of you are more tech savvy than me and might even know a faster way to do it, but those are the simplest ways to do it. I want to see your analysis, and it needs to use all 3 lenses. So it must have examples of analyzing it using rhythm, of rhyme, notes on that, and also, I didn't really type this out here, but analyzing the figures of speech and that sort of thing needs to be illustrated. And then the last page will be a works cited page. Now notice I'm using the term works cited because there's only one works cited, and that's the poem. There should be no additional sources used for analyzing this poem. Now you can go watch documentaries, interviews, and all that sort of stuff. Don't quote from those. Don't have any of that in the paper. Just use that to inform your analysis of the poem, particularly if you don't know how to analyze it yourself as a jumping off point. So that's basically what you need to do for pulling this all together. I am going to save these notes for you. This PC, desktop, explication of poem notes, and put this with the video wherever I place it in your website. If you're online students, this will go in the discussion board. If you are a face-to-face student, it will go probably in the content section. And I am going to upload this video now. So email me any of your questions that you might have, or put them on the discussion board. They'll be great for fodder for discussion. And I hope this video helps you write a really quality essay. These are probably my favorite to read when they go well, and the ones that depress me the most when they go poorly. So hopefully